What if everything you thought was settled was never settled at all? What if the silence you believed meant peace was actually a countdown? And what if a quiet Utah street in the middle of the night exposed a legal and emotional war that has been building for months? This is not just another Sister Wives headline. This is the moment where custody, control, and consequence collide. And once you see how the pieces connect, you will realize why this story cannot be ignored and why what happens next changes everything. What follows is part one of this unfolding story, and it must be understood as a narrative reconstruction based on reported claims, theories, and observed behavior rather than verified conclusions, because the moment we stop treating this like entertainment and start recognizing it as a real-life collision of power, legality, and consequence, everything changes. The night in question did not announce itself with sirens or headlines. It crept in quietly through timestamps, metadata, and the uneasy realization that something was wrong. The footage was brief, grainy, and unsettling, not because of what it showed, but because of where and when it showed it. A residential street still wrapped in darkness, a figure arguing with responding officers, an idling vehicle that did not match any production records, and a timestamp that placed the encounter deep into the early morning hours. Observers immediately noticed what was missing. No cameras, no crew, no consent, no schedule. Insiders insist this was not a visit planned through family channels or network logistics. This was something else, something urgent, something reactive, and according to multiple sources, it was driven by a belief that time had run out. For months, the public had been encouraged to believe that the separation had reached a quiet equilibrium, that relocation had been resolved through mutual understanding, and that the remaining connections were emotional, not legal. But legal analysts now suggest that assumption may have been dangerously premature because custody agreements do not exist in spirit, they exist on paper, and if paperwork is incomplete, unsigned, or improperly filed, belief does not equal protection, and in that gap between belief and documentation, pressure builds silently. Every mile driven, every visit missed, every call unanswered becomes a data point, and insiders allege those data points were being collected methodically, not for reconciliation, but for leverage. The theory gaining traction among observers is that what appeared to be disengagement was actually patience, and what appeared to be peace was actually positioning. Because when jurisdiction changes, leverage shifts. And when leverage shifts, those who feel power slipping often act not when they are calm, but when they are cornered. This is why timing matters, why the early hour matters, why the location matters, because jurisdiction in custody law is not abstract, it is physical. It is where the child sleeps, goes to school, receives medical care, and builds routine. And once that foundation solidifies, another state cannot simply reclaim authority without challenge, and challenge takes time, time that insiders believe was running out. The relocation crossed an invisible threshold, and with it, the balance of control shifted irrevocably. And that shift may have triggered what followed, because desperation rarely announces itself as desperation. It disguises itself as urgency, as righteousness, as last chances. Observers now point to subtle changes in demeanor over recent months. Heightened rigidity, sudden fixation on rights language, repeated references to contracts and states and authority that once sounded emotional now sound procedural. And that reframes earlier moments not as outbursts, but as signals, because people often tell you exactly what they are planning long before they act. But without context, those warnings sound like noise. The emerging picture suggests that this was never about closure, it was about containment, about preventing a future in which relevance, access, and authority diminished. Beyond recovery, and when that future became imminent, action followed abruptly, quietly, and without coordination, because coordinated actions leave records, and records invite resistance. The appearance in Utah, according to sources, was meant to be swift, decisive, and uncontested, a physical assertion intended to precede legal formalization, because possession changes narrative and narrative influences courts. This is not speculation pulled from thin air. It is a known strategy discussed openly in family law circles, because once a child is physically with one parent, emergency filings become easier, arguments sound more credible, and momentum shifts. The belief among analysts is that the attempt was designed to create a new status quo before the system could react. But what disrupted that plan was awareness, preparedness, and the presence of third parties that shifted the encounter from private maneuver to public record. And once law enforcement became involved, unpredictability replaced control because officers respond to immediate disturbance, not long-term strategy, and confusion favors caution, not compliance. This is where the plan faltered and where the story changes, because failure does not dissolve intent, it exposes it, and exposed intent invites scrutiny, which is exactly what followed as observers began re-examining every previous assumption, every narrative beat, every unexplained trip, and every delayed filing. Patterns emerged that had been invisible when viewed in isolation, and once those patterns aligned, the story no longer resembled a family dispute. It resembled a race against time, a race shaped by jurisdiction, deadlines, contractual relevance, and the fear of becoming obsolete. Because in long-running public narratives, visibility equals leverage, and leverage equals survival. And when survival feels threatened, people rationalize actions they would otherwise condemn. This is not about villains or heroes. It is about systems under strain and the dangerous decisions that strain can produce, especially when adults confuse entitlement with urgency and authority with ownership. And at the center of this growing storm stands a child whose routine had finally stabilized, whose life had finally quieted, and whose safety now depends not on belief or narrative, but on the integrity of legal process, which moves slowly, deliberately, and without regard for emotional momentum. And that mismatch between urgency and law is what makes this moment so volatile, because urgency demands action now, while law demands patience. And those two forces rarely coexist peacefully, which is why this story did not begin in a courtroom. It began on a sidewalk, in the dark, with raised voices, flashing lights, and the sudden realization that what everyone thought was over may never have been resolved at all. What follows in part 2 deepens the picture rather than resolves it, because once the first attempt failed, the situation did not de-escalate, it recalibrated. And according to observers, recalibration is often more dangerous than impulse because it removes surprise and replaces it with calculation. Insiders now describe a shift from physical urgency to procedural aggression, where the focus moves from presence to paper, from driveways to filings, because when one path closes, another opens, and legal mechanisms exist specifically for moments like this, moments framed as emergencies, moments where one side claims imminent harm and the other is not present to respond. Analysts explain that these mechanisms are powerful precisely because they bypass dialogue and rely on trust between the filer and the court, trust that can be influenced by presentation, language, and selective context. And this is where the narrative turns darker, because reports suggest that filings were prepared not after the failed encounter, but before it, meaning the physical attempt and the procedural attempt were parallel strategies, not sequential reactions, which implies foresight and preparation rather than panic. And that distinction matters because it reframes the motivation from emotional reaction to strategic execution. And when strategy enters the equation, the margin for collateral damage widens dramatically. Sources now allege that language being used in these filings centers on psychological harm and alienation, terms that carry significant weight despite their subjective nature, because they are difficult to disprove quickly and devastating if believed even temporarily. Legal experts warn that once such terms appear in a court record, they cast a shadow that can influence every subsequent decision, regardless of outcome. And this may explain the urgency to act before the opposing side could respond, because first impressions in emergency filings often linger long after they are challenged. And this is why observers believe the clock was not just ticking on jurisdiction, but on narrative dominance, because whoever defines the emergency defines the response. And defining the emergency requires framing, not facts. Insiders also point to an additional layer of pressure that intensified this push, which is the reality of contractual relevance in public-facing families, where unresolved conflict sustains visibility, and visibility sustains income. When connections to central figures weaken, leverage dissolves, and with it, bargaining power, both legally and professionally. Analysts emphasize that this does not mean actions are driven solely by money, but financial instability amplifies fear, and fear narrows perspective, making extreme options appear reasonable when calmer minds would reject them. And as these pressures converged, attention shifted toward the one variable that could not be controlled through paperwork alone, the child herself, because no strategy survives contact with independent agency, and children, especially adolescents, develop awareness faster than adults expect, particularly when they grow up in environments where emotional volatility is normalized. Sources close to the situation suggest that awareness manifested quietly through observation, memory, and documentation, not out of malice but out of self-protection, because when adults argue about rights, children learn to preserve truth, and preservation does not require confrontation, it requires records. And this is where the dynamic fundamentally changes, because once records exist, control evaporates, and those who sense that evaporation often attempt retrieval, not of connection, but of information. Containment becomes the objective rather than custody, and this reframes subsequent moves not as parental concern, but as risk management, because exposure threatens credibility, and credibility underpins both legal standing and public narrative. Insiders suggest that the realization that information could surface beyond private channels triggered a second wave of urgency, one less visible but more far-reaching. Because while physical attempts draw attention, filings happen quietly, often without public scrutiny. And when paired with jurisdictional complexity, they can outpace response if the opposing side hesitates even briefly. This is why experts stress the importance of immediate legal counteraction in such cases, because delay is interpreted as acquiescence, and silence is rarely neutral in emergency proceedings. The situation now, according to analysts, exists in a precarious holding pattern where outcomes hinge not on truth alone, but on timing, responsiveness, and the ability of courts to coordinate across state lines, which historically they do imperfectly, because statutes differ, interpretations vary, and enforcement depends on cooperation rather than command. And in these gaps, families fracture further, because uncertainty breeds fear, fear breeds reaction, and reaction breeds escalation. This is not speculation, but pattern documented repeatedly in interstate custody conflicts. And the reason this case feels especially volatile is because public attention intersects with private vulnerability, increasing stakes for everyone involved, which in turn increases the temptation to control narrative rather than resolve conflict. Observers caution that the coming phase will test restraint more than resolve, because the most dangerous moment in any legal conflict is not when plans succeed, but when they fail narrowly, because near success convinces actors they were right to try, and that next time they simply need to adjust variables. And that belief can lead to persistence beyond reason, which is why those watching this unfold emphasize the need to de-escalate through lawful channels rather than repetition of failed tactics, because each attempt increases risk, not just legally, but emotionally, for the child at the center, who experiences instability not as theory, but as lived reality. And while adults debate jurisdiction and rights, she absorbs tone, fear, and unpredictability, shaping her understanding of safety in ways that last far beyond any court order. This is the cost rarely calculated when urgency overrides empathy, and it is why experts insist that resolution must prioritize stability over victory, because winning emotion does not heal trust, and reclaiming authority does not restore connection. And until that truth is acknowledged, the conflict will continue to mutate, searching for new avenues to assert control, even as its original purpose becomes harder to justify. And that is where the story stands now, unresolved, tense, and suspended between process and impulse, with outcomes that remain uncertain and consequences that will endure regardless of who claims success. What happens next will not be decided by emotion or public opinion, but by timing, paperwork, and restraint. A child's safety, a family's future, and the truth behind this conflict all depend on what unfolds after the cameras stop rolling. This story is no longer about the past. It is about the choices being made right now. And once those choices are locked in, There is no undo button. Stay aware, stay thoughtful, because the next move will define everything.